All right, so here we are at the final video lecture of the term, and this is lecture 11. And today we're going to look at comparison and contrast essays. Now, as I said, I believe in lecture 10, do not write a comparative analysis, a comparison and contrast essay for the final term paper. Do not do that, okay? But the reason why I'm doing this final lecture is that you may be asked to do one of these, down the road, and so hang on to it. But you do not have to watch this full lecture for this course. Okay, I just want to be nice and clear about that. Okay, and so let's do a couple of definitions. Then I'll show you how to do it. And so the definition: pointing out similarities is called comparing. Pointing out differences is called contrasting. Okay, so that's the standard definition for comparison and contrast. All right. When we assess both similarities and differences, we are engaging in comparison and contrast. All right. Often, however, people will use the term comparison almost interchangeably to mean comparing, contrasting, or both, right? And so if you're ever asked to do a comparative analysis, this is what we're talking about. So let me repeat that. If someone asks you to write a comparative analysis, they mean comparison or contrast or both. All right? Okay. And so comparison, it's interesting. We compare all the time without even thinking about it. It's a natural mental process, right? Something we do consciously or unconsciously. And so if you think about it, if we go back to lecture 9 or 10, I was talking about compound and complex sentences and like the whole idea of things going together, right? The word that I used was coordinating, right? Coordinating conjunctions and all of that. And again, don't worry about the definitions, but we tend to compare all the time. So comparing like what would go with what. There's a great a book on that whole subject called Ways of Seeing, and it's all about art and how certain artists use comparison without even realizing it. Right? It's by John Berger. But anyway, very short. If you're interested in art history, it's a tiny, tiny little book. It's about 60 pages long, and most of it is just paintings. But then there's commentary at the bottom of each. All right. Anyway, and so when we use comparison, we answer these three very basic questions. But actually, when I say basic, one of them is quite important. And so we can ask the obvious question: what are the main similarities between S1 and S2 when S stands for the subject, as usual, right? What are the differences between S1 and S2 when, once again, S stands for the subject? And then what are the main similarities and differences between S1 and S2? All right, so very, very obvious stuff there. Okay, and so a couple of things to think about at this point. Now, if I'm showing you as the reader, if I'm writing a comparative analysis, we can sometimes get into trouble because if you take a look at the three elements that I just gave you there, well, okay, what are the main similarities? What are the main differences? Or like both? Well, that's why I'm suggesting you shouldn't really be doing this for a paper for this course, and you only should do it if you're asked to, because if you're only showing similarities or only showing differences, well then you're not really creating an argument. And I have more to say about that at the very end of the lecture. If you're asked to do this, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 questions you should ask in order to understand exactly what the objective is. And so, if you were asked in school, let's just say, or at work, to use a comparison pattern, you might have to analyze or evaluate. All right? And so an exam question, not ours, we don't have an exam, but an exam question you may come across would be something like, what are the similarities and differences between IBM and Mac computers? Or I guess nowadays, PCs and Mac computers, I guess I should have there. Okay, so whatever. Anyway, now The real question becomes, how do we organize a paper in comparative analysis? So that's really the question that I want to show you, or the issue that I want to show you here. All right. So now here on the top of page 2, this first point looks really obvious. As a matter of fact, a couple of these look really obvious, but think about what I'm about to say. The first question you have to ask is, are the two terms, are the two items really comparable? Now, at first, as I said, that sounds really obvious. But in fact, there's a couple of things we want to think about there. And I'm going to show you exactly how to do that in just a moment. The second point, what are the terms of comparison? And notice I have bolded the word terms. So now let's go back to, my goodness, I can't even mention which lecture because I've mentioned it in at least 3 or 4. When I say the terms of comparison, well, in an odd way, that will become then the sections of your argument, right? Remember, I keep saying everything kind of works together in writing if you follow the principles. And so when I say the terms of comparison, I simply mean the sections or the umbrella terms or the areas of argument as we break everything down, right? So, like I said, everything works together. Okay? All right. Then finally, and that's really what I'm going to get into in the next 10 minutes or so, what is the most appropriate pattern of organization to use? And there are basically 2. Okay? And I'll show you. So basically, the writer of a comparison must be sure that a meaningful similarity exists between the two subjects. Now, that's where it gets kind of interesting, because now we can go back to lecture 3, I think. Yeah, lecture 3, where I talked about structure. And I talked about imposing a sense of structure onto a paper. Well, now, that's where we can start to play around with these ideas. The writer makes sure that there is a similarity between the two subjects. So I'm going to show you in just a second how I can actually take 2 subjects that don't seem to really be comparable, and then I'm going to change the language, and all of a sudden they do become comparable. That's where you can play around with language. That's where you can play around with words. Okay? All right. You'll see what I mean. And so basically, notice where I have the, again, bolded. They must have something significant in common. But that's where you impose the significance. Okay, what the heck do I mean by that? You'll see. So, after you decide that the 2 subjects are comparable because of maybe some manipulation you did on your part, then you have to carefully consider the terms of comparison. So, once you've imposed as I said, the similarities between, then you have to figure out, okay, how exactly will I do this? How will I compare? And so, if, for instance, and I think this is a really good example, if you were asked to do a comparison between 2 engineering firms, it doesn't really matter. That could be X or widget or whatever, right? It would make little sense to compare the management structure and computer systems of one firm to the washrooms and cafeteria food of the other. Now, I know that sounds silly, what I just did there. But watch what I'm about to do, because what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change a word or 2. That's going to change the terms of comparison, and all of a sudden now, I have a nice structured essay. Okay? You'll see what I mean. So, resemblances, differences, whatever, must be assessed in the same terms or categories. Well, that goes back to, if you remember, our the way in which we set up an introduction, right, with our sections of argument. Okay? I know I'm repeating myself, but it works exactly the same way. It's just a matter of, in a moment, I'll show you, well, how exactly do we set it up? All right? Okay, so if you were asked to do the comparison of 2 engineering firms, and at first you started out with the very, very weak terms of comparison, okay, well then, let's then get into that whole parallel structure that I talked about in lecture 9 or 10, where now we get identical, well, maybe identical is not the right word, but consistent words that set up the terms of comparison. So, I could take a look at the 2 engineering firms, and I could look at management structure, computer systems, and employee facilities. So notice now, by changing just a couple of simple words, right? Like really basic changes, all of a sudden now we do have a nice structure to the paper. And that's exactly how all of writing works. Sometimes you have to manipulate some of the words in order to give you a sense of flow, right? And so I think that's a perfect example there, because that goes back once again to our umbrella terms, the sections of argument, areas of argument, whatever terms you want to use. So there it is right there. So at first, it looked like I had horrible terms that set up the way in which I was going to go about my comparison. By changing a couple of words, now all of a sudden I have a good structure to the paper. And so think about that in your own writing, okay? Think about that in all of your writing from here on in, okay? All right. And so basically, as I said, so back then to our computer comparison. Let's just say you were asked, you've been given the task of you have to figure out, we're going to buy a whole lot of computers for our department, and you've been authorized to. Yeah, sorry, I had a tiny bit of a mental block there. So you've been designated. You're the one who has to decide what kind of systems are we going to use. Let's just go back again. Are we going to use PCs? Are we going to use Apple? Okay, Macs, whatever. Okay, doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter because everything comes down to, as I said here, computer A, computer B, or computer C. So you keep all these things generic, then you plug the actual specific information in as you go along, okay? Like when need be. All right. So there are many different aspects. We're talking like thousands of dollars, right? Tens of thousands of dollars. So I have to make a decision on which ones are we going to use to streamline our company. All right. So basically, I have determined, after doing a bit of research, I have determined that the three most important elements that I'll be looking at will be price, okay, P, speed, S, and maintenance, okay? All right. Now, in a comparison and contrast model, there's a couple of different ways we could do this. So that's why I've laid it out the way that I have in your notes, and now I'm on page 3, okay? So in a comparison contrast model, okay, and by the way, that is often used in business reports. Quite often, what a business report will do is it will, first of all, lay out all the information. Then it will probably have recommendations at the end. Okay, and so that's exactly what I've shown you here. So there's two different fundamental models that we could do here, but I'm going to show you something, a little tip. All right. Okay. So in the first model, we could do something that's called purpose and scope. You don't have to worry about that for this course, but later on, if you're ever taking a business class, they'll talk about purpose and scope, and it's kind of similar to an introduction, right? Makes sense, right? As I said, everything writing like more or less works the same way, except there are different terms. So we have purpose and scope. So now I want to show you something really important to improve your writing. So we'll look at computer A. I'm on the left-hand column right now. And then we have price, okay? Then we have speed. Then we have maintenance. Then we'll look at computer B. Price, speed, maintenance. Then we'll look at computer C. Price, speed, maintenance, okay? And then finally, recommendations or conclusion. All right. Now, think about that for a moment. Let's just say we set it up that way. I can almost guarantee you that a paper like that, a report like that, would end up being very repetitive, because basically you have chosen the subjects, the computers, to be the headings. And so I would argue that is not a very good way of setting up any kind of paper, especially a comparative analysis. So now let's look at Model 2, which is far more effective. We have our purpose and scope. Purpose and scope simply means like the parameters, right? What will we be looking at? Exactly the way you would set up an introduction. Then we're going to look at price, then speed, and then finally maintenance. it sounds like a very small thing, but it totally changes the tone of the paper. Okay, the tone of the essay, the report, whatever. It all works the same way. And so, and then we could have our recommendations. So notice the subjects themselves are not the umbrella headings. Instead, you create your umbrella headings, then you include the subjects within. Okay, maybe I'll say that one more time. So the subjects are not the umbrella terms. Instead, the umbrella terms you create, then you bring in each subject as need be. That avoids repetition. That avoids repetition in a very, very big way. All right? So it looks like it almost looks too simplistic, but it totally changes the way in which the paper unfolds. All right? So think about that. Okay? And so the next point, I think, is now kind of obvious. It's up to the writer now to choose which pieces of information will serve as headings. Right? So, and that goes back to the 15 steps on structure. Right? Remember, I think it's number 6 or 7, you impose a kind of logic onto the paper. Right? Okay. Anyway, all right. And then, yeah, there it is. Like, again, I'm anticipating the notes because I've talked about this many, many times. And so, structure then. You want to think about structure before you actually get into the content. Okay? And I think that makes sense. And so, like I said, on the top of page 4 now, what we must do is create or impose the structure. And you do that how? By choosing the proper section headings. Right? Right. Like repetitive. Well, I did say, sorry, a bit of allergies again, but I did say that by the time we get to the end of the course, there will be repetition because I'm trying to reinforce many of the things that we've talked about all along. All right? Okay. And so the only thing left to do is now we have to consider, okay, any problems that will ensue if I have too much information. And so remember, I talked about that in structure as well, where, okay, I've got all this very interesting information, but maybe I have a couple of things that don't really fit. All right, then maybe I leave them out. Maybe they'll come in handy some other time. Okay? And that, again, it doesn't really matter the actual assignment. Writing works the same way. The content changes, but the structure remains. Okay? All right. And so, if I then have too much information within one area, then remember I can always break that down as well. I can break down a section into subsections, and that goes back to paragraphing. Okay, I think that's lecture 6. I could be wrong. No, it's not lecture 6. It's either 5 or 7, but it doesn't matter. Like basically everything works the same way in writing. Try to remember that. It's like I said, it's not the content necessarily when it comes to first year papers. It's the structure. It's how you put stuff together. The content is obviously important, but the structure is just as important, if not more, right? Because if I've said this 1,000 times on this course, you might have great content, but if all you're doing is making point after point after point, then the reader gets bored. You have to think about, how do I put all this together? And that's key. That is key to really effective writing. Okay? So planning. Like, again, the 15 steps to organization. Okay. And so that is then, as like, it's amazing how, I'm not amazing, like, not amazing, but it is funny how I anticipate many of the notes because, again, everything falls into place. So, if you find that you have a section that is far too large, then you break it down into subordinate groups, right? But you make sure that those subordinate groups each have similarities in their own. There are connections there. Then, once you're finished with those groups, right, guess what? We then introduce a transitional sentence, which takes us into the next group, right? Like, I know, I'm repeating myself, but again, all writing works the same. Okay, and so basically then I'm going to jump just a bit because I'm basically just repeating myself now. So what are some possible headings then? Like when we start to look at research and we start to think about, okay, how can I group things? Okay, how can how can I group things? Well, here are some quick notes just to, like, off the top of my head. Like, I wrote these down, but there's so many different ones. But you want to think about almost. Do you remember we talked about compound nouns, right? Remember the compound noun, lecture 9 or 10? Okay, well, actually, those types of words work very well when it comes to subject headings. Okay, umbrella terms, areas of argument, whatever. Historical, statistical, environmental, moral, genus, okay, or genus, family, political, economic, etc. So again, I could be writing a paper on almost any topic, and I'm sure some of these headings would come into play. I mean, economic. Almost any topic when it comes to politics or whatever, economics will probably, apply. So these are the types of words you're thinking about when it comes to not only a comparative analysis, but any type of writing, where you want to end up figuring out organization and structure. Okay? All right. And so, yeah, well, like it says right there, the possibilities are endless, right? But you want to make sure the umbrella term incorporates the entire section with which you're dealing. Okay? And yes, that was proper grammar, even though I sounded like an egghead. All right. Anyway. All right. So then, after we start thinking about all those things, and it's interesting how in the first couple of lectures, I talked about how many things, if you do the work ahead of time, many things will fall into place. Well, if you've done the research, if you started thinking about the umbrella terms, like organizing, all those kinds of things, then basically your structure should almost fall into place. But for a comparative analysis, there are two very, very specific ways to do it. So I'm almost going to read now, like word for word, to give you an idea of the two different patterns that are used in comparative analysis, and I'll explain when does one work as opposed to the other. Okay? All right. And so the two different ways are, you could either do subject to subject or point to point. So that goes back to page 3, where I was showing you those two models, right? In the first model, it was subject to subject, and I suggested that may not be the best way of doing it. Then in the second model, it was point to point. Now, if that's a bit vague, then we'll get into it right now, and I'll explain. So basically, we have the subject to subject model is actually known as the chunk pattern. And again, these aren't my words. These are, like, if you look up textbooks, these are the terms that'll be used. Then, if you're looking at the, something just came in on my computer, so you might have heard that. But if you take a look at the second model, that would be known as the slice pattern. Okay? Very straightforward stuff once I start explaining it. So if you're going to do a paper, a comparative analysis according to the chunk pattern, well, then basically you take your two subjects. Well, it could be more than two, but I'll just start with two. All right? You take your two and you discuss each one separately. So let me just give you a couple of examples here. All right? Let's just say you were asked to do a comparative analysis of a novel which was turned into a film. But again, the content could be anything. I could have said simply X, Y, right? It doesn't matter. So we're going to take a look at the novel and we're going to take a look at the movie, okay? The film. All right. And so basically you could do it this way. Well, first I'll look at the characters, okay, in the novel, then in the film, then I'll look at the plot, okay, or sorry, the setting, and then I'll look at the plot, okay? If you're taking an English course, don't do that. This is a very basic model, okay? We can get much more. If you are taking an English class, like a literature class, we can get way more sophisticated than that. That would not do very well on a paper. But anyway, all right. And so, if you were first, you could first discuss the novel in terms of the same 3 points, and then the film. So, okay, here would be an outline, and again, I'm saying this isn't a very good example, but it will work in very certain conditions. So, here's an example of a chunk pattern for such an essay. Okay, so we have our first paragraph, which is our introduction, with, of course, the sections of argument and the thesis statement. Okay. Like, I mean, I don't know if I needed to actually elaborate on that. Like, we've been through that, right? So, now notice what I've written there. Second paragraph or section 1. So think about that. So section 1, well, let's talk about the novel, the characters, the setting, the plot. But now think about that just for a second. We could easily break that down, couldn't we? Where now we actually have maybe 3 sections within section 1. We have subsections. That goes back, sorry about that. That goes back to paragraphing, where we start to break ideas down. And so our controlling elements would be characters, then setting, then plot. So again, that's how writing works. We have a whole lot of information, then we start to group ideas and make sense out of them. Okay? All right. Then we could do the next paragraph, but again, that's not really the best word to use. That's why in the lecture I have, or section 2. And so we then have the film, character, setting, plot, and we could break that down as well into subsections. But you'll notice how there is there's a possible problem if you set your paper up that way. Okay? We have our conclusion, right? Summarizing the similarities, the differences, whatever. But there's a couple of problems here. On the one hand, if you read a paper this way and it was, say, 20 pages, well, then you would end up with 2 separate papers. And the reader may forget much of the information that you included in the first half of the paper. Okay? Also, if all you're doing is showing the similarities and the differences, then you don't really have an argument. And don't worry, at the end of the lecture, I'm gonna fix that for you. Okay? But that is one of the problems, though, when it comes to a comparative analysis. Okay. And so, the chunk method would be best served in shorter papers. Maybe an essay on an exam that asked for like a one page comparison. Okay, well then in that case, yeah, the reader can retain the information that is given. But once we start getting into longer papers, then the reader will not be able to retain the information, and as I said, you probably end up having 2 different papers. Okay? All right. And so, perhaps, I would argue almost always, you'll end up structuring a comparative analysis in what is known as the slice pattern. Okay? Again, these aren't my terms, all right? So that's where all of a sudden now we go back to page 3, I believe it was, and we look at model 2, where now we have the terms of the terms or categories of comparison, right, aren't the subjects. Instead, they're the umbrella terms that you impose. Then once you have that, then you bring in the subjects as needed. All right? And so the subjects then become basically they're underneath the umbrella term, okay, within each section. All right. And so the essay it communicates the exact same information, but simply in a different way. And so here is the template now for the slice pattern. You have, once again, your introduction, thesis statement, sections of argument, and all of that, all right? Then you have characters. Then we could do novel film. Then we have setting, novel film. And notice I'm going to do it consistently. Plot, novel film. So now all of a sudden we get into a much more interesting dynamic when it comes to the way in which the information unfolds. So looks like a very simple thing, but in fact, no, it actually works much better. So this would be the type of paper that would be ideal to longer reports or essays or what have you, when the terms of comparison become more complex. Okay? And therefore, then, the reader can actually retain, okay, it's the third time I've used that word, but that is the idea. You want the reader to remember. And so by doing it this way, yes, the reader can retain information much better. All right? And so, once we've seen our structure, then we figure out, oh, all right, now how do we come up with a thesis statement? Now that's difficult. That's difficult. And so that's why, it's basically the last thing we're going to do today. Like we're almost done. We're almost done with the course because I figured the very last lecture we do, no point in prolonging it, right? I figured 35 minutes. And so, okay. So let's take a look at some thesis statements, and then let's take a look at effective and non-effective ones. Here's the first example that I could draft for a thesis statement in a comparison paper. S1 and S2, where once again S equals the subjects, okay, can be compared in terms of A, B, and C. Okay, well, yeah, that's true. So, if I were to write that statement, then the question becomes, do I really have an argument? And so that's something you want to think about, okay? Do I have an argument if I simply say S1 and S2 can be compared in terms of A, B, and C? Not really. Instead, I'm kind of making a statement, right? So it's not really an argument. It's like, that's one of the phrases that I think should be rethought, is a thesis statement. Because a really strong thesis is not just a statement, it's an argument. It makes a case. So by writing it this way, there isn't really a case. So let me give you a poor example, a bad example. X and Y, okay, doesn't matter what they are, can be compared in terms of their power bases, religious backgrounds, and family ties. Okay? And I believe when I was creating the notes, I'm thinking there maybe of two politicians. Okay? But notice, so if you were to do something like that, you could just write, you could go on forever just writing about, okay, so these are the similarities and the differences between the two. But what is the argument? There is no argument. And so that's why I'm going to finish off today, you'll see in just a moment, right, with some questions you should ask if you ever have to write a comparative analysis. Okay? All right. Then on the top of page 7, well, S1 and S2, so same subjects or whatever, can be contrasted in terms of A, B, and C. But you see, you see the problem there, I hope, right? That, again, you're not really saying anything in terms of making a case. You're laying out information. And perhaps that's all that your instructor wants. Maybe that's fine. But chances are, in order to get a better grade, you would want to create some kind of argument. Okay? All right. So here's my example. College and university can be contrasted in terms of cost, instruction, and orientation. Okay, fine. But that doesn't really create any kind of argument. It simply suggests that I'm going to give information to the reader. Right? Okay. Now, I could take that same idea and maybe make it a tiny bit better by saying simply, based on A, B, and C, the research indicates the best approach, okay, to whatever would be, okay? And so by that, I'll do that in a tiny bit differently. I'll do that, Based on ABC, the research indicates that maybe the best outcome would be, or the best decision would be, or the best solution would be. So in other words, if I simply include a couple of words like the best, most important, or what have you, okay, or worst, then all of a sudden now I can take a comparative analysis and turn it into an argument. So I'll do that again. I'll say that one more time. So I could say These two things could be contrasted in terms of A, B, and C. But I could then turn it around and say, based on all the information of A, B, and C, this one actually works the best. So it's a matter of just not twisting, but manipulating information, words, I should say, manipulating words to turn like basically information into an argument. And by doing that with just a couple of simple words, all of a sudden the tone of the paper changes dramatically. And that's how writing works. Like, we're almost done with the course, and I keep going back to that. The tone of the paper is so important, and the tone can change based on a couple of words in your thesis. Because if you then accommodate the words that have changed the thesis into an argument within the entire paper, the paper becomes argumentative throughout. Okay? In other words, you can't just add a couple of words to say the best, the most, or whatever, but then forget about using that tone in the rest of the paper. You want to keep that in mind as you work through. But as you do that, then, as I said, then you actually have an argumentative piece rather than an informative piece. So that's why I say you want to be careful when it comes to a comparative analysis. And so that's why I end off the lecture today and the course with some suggestions to keep in mind. Okay? So let's just say you were asked to write a comparative analysis. Okay? I'm just taking a look here at the notes. But let's just say you were asked to write one. Okay. Well then, first of all, I've already shown you that a comparative analysis can be quite vague. Okay? Because maybe you don't have an argument. But maybe that's what the instructor is looking for. Okay, well, so how do you know what path to take? Okay, if you're ever asked to write a paper like this in school, okay, or in the business environment, then here are some questions to consider. Okay, are you expected to create an argument? That's the first question. Or are you simply expected to show similarities and differences? Okay. Will you be expected to propose recommendations? You see, usually the essays that we have done in our course, well, you wouldn't be showing recommendations. But when you start to get out into the business world, or if you're studying business or other disciplines, then maybe you will. And so that's where all of a sudden business writing comes into play. Okay, and there are many, many books out there, or you can go online and find ways to put proposals together and things like that, right? And so, yeah, that might be another question. Then, will anyone have to act on your findings? So again, now we're getting more into business proposals, and that's usually when comparative analysis works quite well. It has more to do with business proposals, or at least it works better with business proposals than it does with essays. Okay? And so that's why I said we're going to finish off with this concept, comparative analysis, because I don't want you to do it for our course. Don't do it for our course. But maybe you'll need it somewhere else. So I've given you the two patterns, right? The structural patterns, right? And then some questions you want to think about as well. And so the last two questions in like what I just gave you there, as I said, they're more related to business proposals. But as I said, I think you should always know what is expected. Okay? So let's just say, one of the final things I'm going to talk about, let's just say you were asked to do a comparative analysis in a university course. What I would suggest is don't raise your hand. Okay? Don't raise your hand. Wait until the end of the class. Then go down and ask the instructor on your own, okay? Ask them the questions that I just gave you there. That might give you a bit of a leg up, shall we say, on the grading of the assignment. Okay? Anyway, all right. So, well, believe it or not, that's the end of the course. I hope you enjoyed it. And good luck with the rest of your university career and beyond. Okay? Thank you very much. All right. Bye-bye.